what was shared over Signal, then and now, however you characterize it, was informal, unclassified coordinations for media coordination and other things.
We don't want to wait till we get to a place where citizens are being deported. Now's the time to draw the line in the sand.
We are here to stand up against President Trump and Elon Musk and his design to silence the not-for-profits that are working every day to make sure we have clean air, clean water.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington tonight on America Decides. On the defensive, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth facing some calls in some quarters to resign. He, of course, remains defiant and blames former staffers we should note he brought into the senior Pentagon leadership for leaking details about a Signal chat where he reportedly discussed sensitive military plans with his wife, his brother, and his personal attorney. What we know about this second group chat and the White House processing of it all. Economic blow. The International Monetary Fund slashes the forecast for future U.S. economic growth and warns President Trump's tariff policies might generate more global economic uncertainty. Demanding release, the Justice Department continues to stonewall a judge's order to explain what the Trump administration has done and plans to do, if anything, to free Kilmar Abrego Garcia from El Salvador. I want to start tonight with Nancy Cordes at the White House. Nancy, how would, from your reporting there at the White House, you assess the job security of Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth?
Major, every single White House official we talk to says that Hegseth is safe not only in the short term, but in the long term. They insist that he is doing a great job, that President Trump believes he's doing a great job. President Trump himself said that yesterday, and we've seen Hegseth out there today making the case for himself in a cable news interview. This is a White House, as you well know, that tends to rally around its own, and in this case, Pete Hegseth, despite the many controversies that he's been involved in, is one of their own. There is an ongoing question about these men who served him in very high-ranking capacities who have now been let go. He suggested that this investigation into whether they leaked information about him might be referred to the Justice Department, but then when the White House press secretary was asked about that today, she said she claimed not to know anything about that. So the fate of these three top aides, some who, as you pointed out, have been with Hegseth, have known him for years, is still very up in the air.
And is there any sense at the White House, Nancy, that this discussion of military plans, highly sensitive, whether they're classified or not, is a separate matter? Is conduct consistent with an effective defense secretary, or this turmoil within the senior ranks of the Pentagon is something they find consistent with a successful and effective defense secretary?
Major, anytime we've asked about that, they turn the question around on its head, and they say what they're really worried about is that these old stories are being peddled by people who have an axe to grind, who are not on board with Hegseth's plans to overhaul the military and simply want to hurt him. President Trump saying, for example, that he got rid of a lot of bad people, Hegseth that is, and that's why he has made these enemies. They simply are not engaging, Major, on the question of whether it was appropriate for Hegseth to share this sensitive information in not one, but now we know 2 Signal chats.
And Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, told investors behind closed doors today that he sees the tariff situation with China as, quote, unsustainable. What might that mean?
That was a recognition that many on Wall Street have come to a while ago, which is that the fact that the U.S. has imposed 145% tariffs on many Chinese goods and that China has imposed 125% tariffs on U.S. goods is simply devastating for hundreds, if not thousands, of U.S. small and medium-sized businesses, and that the pain is only going to grow the longer this drags on. And so he is acknowledging the reality, which is that the current situation is unsustainable and that there has to be a deal sooner rather than later. Now, the rest of the White House has not acknowledged that. So it was notable that he did say that publicly. But as far as we know, there are still no talks with Chinese officials scheduled. The White House press secretary told us today that she had just spoken with the president and that he wanted us to know that the stage is being set for a negotiation with China, but she would not elaborate on what exactly that means and what concrete steps are taking place now to ensure that these talks start soon.
From the North Line of the White House, Nancy Cordes, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Major.
Kelly O'Grady joins me now from New York. Kelly, we're going to have fun here for a second because in those remarks from the Treasury Secretary to investors behind closed doors, Scott Bessent also said we are involved in a trade embargo with China. Here's the fun part. This is how we opened this show April 11th on that topic. Tonight on America Decides, that means you and I, can stop talking about tariffs in China. It's an embargo. It's a trade embargo. Why? Well, because China today increased its tariff rate against the United States to 125%. The current U.S. rate on Chinese goods, 145%. At that rate, effectively, we're not talking about tariffs. We're talking about a trade embargo. Well, one of the goals of this show is to try to cut through things and get to the essence of it. We're not always going to be perfect, but we tried that day. And I think we got pretty close to it because now the Treasury Secretary, though behind closed doors, agrees. This is an embargo. The bigger thing, Kelly, which you're going to help us get to the essence of, what signals was that trying to send not only to the markets, but to the broader global economy?
Well, it sounds like Treasury Secretary Bessent is watching your show, Major. He took the words right out of your mouth. He didn't credit you. Look, I think that the sentiment that they're trying to convey is that deals are coming. And, of course, we saw the markets react very positively. They were already up to start the day, but we did regain everything in the Dow that we lost yesterday. But after I heard those comments or saw those comments from Bessent, I went and I spoke to a number of investors. And I said, well, what do you think? And by and large, I heard, okay, this is great. There's some optimism, but there was also skepticism because the negotiations, as Bessent himself admitted, have not started. And so you see sort of this momentary bump, but there's a lot more rocky waves ahead, if you will, because until you get that concrete deal that these two sides are meeting, as Nancy was saying, there's likely going to be a lot of skepticism from investors. Also today, the news we talked about as we opened the show, the IMF cutting this year's growth forecast here in America. Yeah, it's unsurprising. So it was sort of a full percentage point lower than what we saw them predict for U.S. growth in January. But I will note, they said no recession, though they did up the probability to 37%. What I felt was really interesting, though, is they had this line in there about how the central bank and the government needs to be separate, that independence is critical for credibility. And of course, as you well know, that question about independence and credibility has been roiling the markets the past few days. Kelly O'Grady, always a pleasure, and I promise you that's the last time I'm going to torment you with watching a soundbite of me. I promise. I want to bring in Scott MacFarlane, who's been following the latest developments, and there are many, in the various immigration court battles. Scott, it's always great to have you at the desk. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, catch us up.
Could be back in court tomorrow. The matter could be back in the federal courthouse in Maryland tomorrow. His defense attorneys, his plaintiff's attorneys are suing the Trump administration to get his return. And they're trying to get back in court, Major, because they're arguing the Trump administration is dragging their feet on handing over information, answering questions, defying what's supposed to be done in court. Now, that's part of a theme, isn't it, where they're accused, the Trump administration is, of defying court orders of bringing Kilmar Abrego Garcia back from the Salvadoran prison. The legal battles are going to continue to play out in the courthouse in Maryland, probably on a trajectory back to the Supreme Court, which ruled that he should be returned. But there's a bigger issue here, I think, than just the legal. I'm seeing a shift, and our sources are seeing a shift in the political strategy here. When you saw a congressional delegation go to El Salvador, the same path Senator Chris Van Hollen took, you see others going to detention facilities from Louisiana to Vermont. You see Democrats engaging on this issue.
Picking up on that point, I want to play sound we have from Mike Garcia, a Democrat from California, after that trip to El Salvador.
We demanded to see Kilmar. We were denied that. They have no interest in working with us in trying to get additional support, but we're going to keep fighting. This case cannot just go away. They want it to go away. We cannot allow this to go away.
As you saw that very helpful chyron, Robert Garcia, my apologies. There's a Mike Garcia, different party. Sorry, I blew that. To your point about the politics from the White House continues relentlessly. Let's put the social media post from President Trump on Truth Social that says Kilmar Abrego Garcia has, according to the president, MS-13 tattooed on his knuckles. If we can bring that up. What do we know about that and the veracity or the truthfulness of that assertion or claim?
From the administration's critics, there's questions about the veracity of the photo, whether that's not a doctored or photoshopped image, putting some type of imagery that wasn't initially there in the picture. But this is an issue the administration wants to be fighting. Deportations, let's talk about Abrego Garcia, let's talk about MS-13, Tren de Aragua, and those have been winning issues in the 2024 cycle. I think it's a winning issue now that he's president. Democrats may have had some equivocation. You heard the California governor, Gavin Newsom, express some concern about engaging on this issue when the focus could be on the economy, on tariffs. There's a growing number of congressional Democrats who want in on this, too.
And who see it as a fundamental issue, not necessarily about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, but about the use and applicability of due process in all matters related to accusations from the government and a defendant's ability to defend himself or herself under due process procedures.
Senator Van Hollen has been crystallizing that argument in particular, that this is not about one man. This is about rule of law and following court orders. This is somebody who was mistakenly deported from Maryland to El Salvador. The senator from that state saying it's more than just this person who was deported from my state.
Scott McFarlane, always a pleasure. Thank you, sir. The Vatican announced the funeral for Pope Francis will take place Saturday at St. Peter's Basilica. The Pope will not, however, be buried there. CBS News senior correspondent Nora O'Donnell is in Rome and has more.
Pope Francis won't be buried at the Vatican like most pontiffs. Instead, he will be buried here at the Basilica of St. Mary Major. It is the largest and most important Marian church in all of Rome. And Pope Francis loves this basilica and has visited it over 100 times, coming here to worship before and after every single one of his international trips. The Holy Father prays to this specific Byzantine icon of the Blessed Virgin Mary. It's called Our Lady Salus Populi Romani, literally means salvation of the Roman people. We visited the basilica and went inside to see the area where it is believed Pope Francis will be laid to rest. It'll be inside or next to the Pauline Chapel in the basilica, where he has spent so much time. We learned that after he had surgery in 2021, he came here to pray before returning to the Vatican. And it really is beautiful inside. Pope Francis won't be the only pope buried here. There are 7 other popes inside, but Francis will be the first in more than 350 years. When we met Pope Francis last year, we learned how he is devoted to the Blessed Virgin Mary. Just above our interview was the painting of Mary, undoer of knots, inside his home in Casa Santa Marta. Pope Francis discovered the saint in the 1980s when he was going through a dark time, and the devotion resonated with him because it symbolizes Mary's role in the undoing of the knots of life's problems. This funeral for Pope Francis will follow many of the centuries-long traditions for popes, but there will be changes. He made changes to the funeral ceremonies just last year, and so his funeral will symbolize, in many ways, his papacy, the simplicity and humility.
Nora O'Donnell in Rome, thank you very much. President Trump and his administration have worked pretty aggressively to dismantle climate protections in the early days of its second time in office. On this Earth Day, we take a look at those moves with former Washington Governor Jay Inslee. He joins me next from New York. You're watching America Decides.
This Earth Day, EPA is powering the Great American Comeback, energizing our economy as we carry out our mission of protecting human health and the environment.
Welcome back. That was EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin's Earth Day message. It comes amid what he calls the largest deregulation of federal environmental rules carried out by the EPA in U.S. history. In response, climate activists are using this day, Earth Day, to have their voices heard on the administration's environmental agenda. Protests have popped up across the country in the run-up to this Earth Day. I want to bring in former Governor of Washington, Jay Inslee. Jay, this is not a new issue for you. You were a large advocate for the environmental policies when you were in Congress, when you were governor. The Trump administration today, in welcoming Earth Day, extolled its acceleration of carbon capture, what it called responsible logging, and opening federal lands to oil, natural gas, and mineral extraction. How does that fit within the Earth Day that you've come to know?
Well, this is a great way to celebrate our home planet, but they've really turned Earth Day into anti-Earth Day because they are trying to take a chainsaw to all of the protections of our children. You know, we've built a house of health for our children's health and clean air and clean water, and they've virtually tried to undo a very significant part of that protection. And we got to understand, look, we have wrapped the Earth in a blanket of pollution. There is no doubt about this. There's a total scientific consensus now that climate change is injuring the future of our children. And today our homes are burning down and it's hard to get insurance. But they essentially have stripped protection for our children while simultaneously hurting our economy and trying to kill the fastest growing part of our sector, which is clean energy. The fastest job creation in the whole industry right now is in clean energy, and they've tried to suppress that. So I have to say they've taken a great celebration and put a damper on it. But here's the good news, Major, if I can. Look, the states can act, and the states are acting. All across the country, I started a group called the U.S. Climate Alliance, 24 states. We are acting to protect our children. We are acting to build clean energy jobs. We're going to keep doing that. You really can't stop us in that.
And when you talk about clean energy jobs, I also want to quote directly from the White House statement on Earth Day, quote, unlike the previous administration, which wasted billions of taxpayer dollars on virtue signaling and ineffective grifts, the Trump administration's policies are rooted in the belief that Americans are the best stewards of our vast natural resources. No green new scam required. That's the rhetoric. What's the policy?
Well, the fact is he's trying to kill jobs in my state. Look, I got thousands of people with great jobs building advanced batteries. A couple companies have the most advanced batteries in the world that can increase the range of your electric car by 20 or 30%. We've got fusion companies moving in, green fertilizer. These are real jobs. He's trying to kill them. What kind of American president is so afraid of wind turbines that he gets up in the morning and tries to kill jobs? I don't understand it. He must have been frightened by a wind turbine at some point because he say they cause cancer. No, they cause jobs. And we want to continue that job growth to continue. He's trying to hurt that in so many ways, in offshore wind, in solar power, in advanced battery manufacturing that I was involved in Congress to get going. This is a growth opportunity. You know, he's hurting our economy through these ruinous tariffs, but he's really hurting our economy now in taking away what should be our dominance in clean energy and trying to give it to the Chinese. That's not a direction we should be going.
Jay, when the administration talks about the benefits of carbon capture, clean coal, and responsible logging, what do you think they mean, and what is your interpretation of those three phrases?
They're meaningless. They're scientifically and economically foolishness, because right now the cheapest energy is solar energy and wind energy and long-term battery storage. That is cheaper in 90% of the markets than coal across the United States. So trying to bring back a dirty substance that is not growing jobs and try to kill the segment that is growing jobs and has 4 or 5 times more employees already than in the coal industry is just nuts. It's trying to harken back and ignore the science that coal is killing our future. And that's a reality, and it's killing our jobs too. So this sequestration idea, if you could do it for free, fine, but you can't. It takes enormous amount of energy to compress CO2, to put it in the ground. For every plant you have, you do that for, you got to build 2 power plants to feed the one doing the electrical compression. So it just doesn't pencil out. It's a dream that is lost. Let's get for the future, which are these new technologies. By the way, it's not the future, it's today. There's 2 silicon anode battery companies in Moses Lake, Washington today, putting 100 people to work in construction and soon manufacturing. Those are the jobs that we got to focus on. And I'm glad our state's moving forward, and we are. And again, I want to come back to this. He can try to reduce the federal action, but our state action can move forward as we have with our climate Commitment Act that was just recently affirmed by a landslide. You want to see a landslide, 62-38. We get it in Washington. We understand clean energy jobs, and we understand what climate change is doing. Those are two things that are winning propositions.
Jay, the Trump administration is also cutting back people and changing the language at NOAA and FEMA in relationship to climate and natural disasters.
Well, listen, you can't ignore reality. You know, he thinks sort of like an ostrich that if you put your head in the sand, climate change will just go away. Mother Nature doesn't work that way. A really uplifting article today I read about University of Washington researchers who have been researching heretofore about the impact on nature throughout the globe. He eliminated that research, but that's not going to eliminate the reality. He can stick his head in the sand, but the tail feathers are still going to get ruffled by climate change. So these University of Washington professors are going to do this on their own nickel to continue them. Hats off to them. Science is so important. And by the way, it's not just climate change, it's cancer researchers. We have these great cancer researchers at the University of Washington and other places. He's trying to cut that off. That's just nuts. It's not who we are. America has led the world because we have led on scientific research. That's been at universities, it's been from our federal agencies, and now to cut that off is just criminal. We could lose a generation of scientists because of this back-asswards approach of Donald Trump. I hope we can turn this around.
Former Democratic Governor of Washington State, Jay Inslee. Appreciate the time, sir. Thanks.
You bet. Good luck. Happy Earth Day.
Town hall for a Trump ally, Republican Congressman Byron Donalds, turns a bit contentious. Our reporter panel has more on the barrage of criticism that was there, voiced by constituents of Donalds about DOGE, Gaza, and DEI, among other topics. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Thank you for staying with us. Another town hall for Republican member of Congress turned, well, maybe chaotic is too strong a word, but it was kind of disruptive. This time for Florida Congressman Byron Donalds. This was the scene in Estero, Florida. Audience members interrupted the congressman. Two people were removed by authorities. I want to bring in our Torian Small, who attended the town hall. Now, Torian, you've been with Byron Donalds for a lot of these events. Give our audience a sense of perspective on how last night was similar, possibly more contentious, maybe less than you've seen previously.
Well, Congressman Donalds, Major, is one not to shy away from confrontation, especially during the 2024 presidential election. He was one of Trump's chief surrogates on the trail. He often would host Black outreach events, and those got pretty heated. This was no different from his town hall here in Estero last night, where he was going back and forth at times with members of the audience. Quite a few, I would say, in fact, about half of the attendees identified as either left-leaning or Democrats. The top topic or subject on the docket yesterday was Elon Musk and Doge. After his event, I asked him about whether or not seeing that ire up close and personal from his constituents changed his opinions on how Doge has operated. This is what he had to say.
There seemed to be a theme, though, with a lot of the questions that we heard tonight. There was concerns about Doge, Elon Musk involvement in the federal government. What's your reaction to seeing this up close in front from your constituents, the concern with Elon Musk fingerprints on the government?
Well, what I found is a lot of the questions and even some of the back and forth was really more about fear or concern, but not facts. And so my responsibility is to bring facts to the equation.
Donalds coming out of this was just as defiant as he was going into this. Again, Major, he is a staunch Trump supporter, and he said he was ready to take on these battles as he saw it because he still firmly believes in the president's mission and says he stands behind what Republicans have been doing, despite the fact that there was quite a bit of concern heard from his supporters, some also of his critics, his toughest critics at that town hall.
Torian Small, thanks so very much. I appreciate it. Our political panel is here at the desk with me. Steph Kite is a politics reporter at Axios. Jake Traylor returning to the desk. I'm glad to say that. White House reporter for Politico. Great to have you both here. So I'm going to update the table on some news from President Trump made just a couple of minutes ago. There was an event that opened up at the White House. He took some questions and said he would not fire Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell. Just wants him to lower interest rates faster than currently indicated. That seems to be important, and I want to play some sound for you that came from this morning on CNBC from European Central Bank head Christine Lagarde. Let's listen.
If there is an attempt by the executive branch in this country to fire Chair Powell before the end of his term, do you see that as a material risk to markets?
I very much hope not.
Hope that doesn't happen.
Hope that it is not a risk.
What would it mean for the markets?
Look, I'm not going to comment on, market reaction to hypotheticals that I hope are just not on the table.
3 times, hope not, hope not, hope not. And clearly the president is trying to, with his remarks late this afternoon that just came in, send some signals that though he's aggravated, he's not going to push that fire button.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating that the president decided to clarify that, because it has been sounding like he was moving in that direction, that he was going to continue
Creating
to put
all
pressure.
sorts of alarms.
Of course, and we haven't seen Trump. He's not one to back down from a fight usually, and I do think there was some concern there when he saw stock markets already reacting just to the possibility of this happening. It is something that Trump cares about. The markets are already in a state of fluctuation over tariffs and other issues that he's had, and so it seems to be an indication that he was watching that, he was listening, and wanted to do something to try to stabilize the situation, at least temporarily.
And Jake, there are lots of days that we could circle on the calendar in the first 100 days of the second Trump administration, but it feels to me like this one may be one we want to double circle. Here's why. The president's remarks just then, trying to clarify what his intentions are about the Federal Reserve chairman, and also the Treasury Secretary, though behind closed doors, telling investors this confrontation economically with China is unsustainable. We are in an effective trade embargo, and we are going to try to reach a deal. It was less than a week ago the president said China doesn't have the cards.
Yeah.
They're going to come crawling. This sounds like a reset day to me.
We've been seeing a lot of back and forth over the past week or so. I mean, Trump called Powell a major loser. I think it was days ago. And so this is
yesterday.
Yesterday. So it feels like 3 weeks. But quite the shift. And it gets to the point of who's in Donald Trump's ear right now. We know he watches the markets. We know that he cares about voter sentiment, even if he says he doesn't. So the question is, who's getting in his ear? Because obviously, at least his public strategy is changing moment by moment, day by day.
And even tariffs. I mean, we already saw him walk back some of the, the initial tariffs that he had announced, and now we're seeing them concerned about the China tariffs. And the question about Trump's tariff policy has always been how long he would be willing to test his theory of the case. He has an idea about tariffs that is contrary to what most economic experts believe to be the case. He wanted to move forward with it anyway, but it's clear that the markets were reacting. People are nervous.
And there was a meeting at the White House with top retailer CEOs. And then there's this remarks today from Bessent about China and the unsustainability, and the president about Jay Powell. I have to believe those are more than coincidentally connected.
There's an art of making the deal, which is what Trump loves to claim he's doing. But then there's also the fact that we have Americans whose pocketbooks are hurting. And even in the town halls that we just referenced just a moment ago, that's something that voters are very upset about. And so there's this balance, there's this tightrope he's trying to walk, and someone's pulling him back a little bit here.
And Jake, evaluate from your reporting the Pete Hegseth situation, the questions, the scrutiny, the competence, and the White House solidarity.
Yeah, I actually, at the Easter egg roll yesterday, I asked Trump if he still has complete confidence in Hegseth, and he kind of laughed and said, why would you even ask that question? Of course I have complete confidence in him. But at the same time, I was talking to a close Trump ally recently who said Trump supports people publicly until the moment he doesn't. And I think his first administration is a good example of that. And another close Trump ally was telling some of my colleagues at Politico this quote about Hegseth specifically. He said, central casting can become problematic if all they're doing is generating questions of instability. So Trump's going to continue to support Hegseth, at least publicly. We know he's done it privately, until the breaking point. The question is now, where is that breaking point? Because things are not looking good over at the Pentagon.
Steph, any insight into that?
I mean, I think it's interesting, to your point, look at the Matt Gaetz for Attorney General situation, right? We saw everyone was going to back Matt Gaetz. They were serious about it. This wasn't a joke. There was all the support. All the MAGA influencers online were coming out of the woodwork defending him until the moment where it was clear that that wasn't going to happen. And then all of a sudden, the nominee was pulled. And do we reach that point?
Right. This one feels different because the White House exerted tremendous pressure to get the confirmation across the finish line. It wasn't certain They've invested a lot of political capital. It feels like they don't want to pull that political capital back or concede a defeat this early on.
And I do think the president appreciates kind of Hegseth's kind of aggressive approach with the media, really pushing back. And, you know, that is something that Trump wants to see. And we've seen that kind of become Hegseth's playbook. Like earlier on, when it looked like Hegseth's nomination was in jeopardy, that was Trump's message to him then. Fight this. We want to see you out there. He's doing that again. But how many times is the White House going to allow Hegseth to pull them back into scandal? We also know the president doesn't like to be outshined by anyone else in his cabinet. And does that become an issue down the road?
Jake, your thoughts on Byron Donalds? Look, some House Republicans have decided not to hold town halls, have teletown halls, Zoom meetings. He's out there doing it. That's a way of engaging with the constituents, taking a lot of feedback. Your sense of what we saw play out last night?
Yeah, so I think it's worth looking at. So the Democrats, they have been hosting town halls frequently, and that's because they are a self-declared party in somewhat crisis right now, trying to figure out who they are. So they've been having a lot of these town halls. Republicans haven't been having as many. But what's interesting is whenever a Republican does have a town hall, they are the ones who have been elected into leadership right now. They have the majority. They have the executive branch. And so there's a bit more of higher stakes when it comes to the fact that these constituents, when they're not pleased, they have one person to look at, and it is these elected Republican leaders, which I find really interesting. We saw some of that at the Donalds town hall last night. Look, people elected Donald Trump to lower prices, and they're not seeing that. That's hitting their pocketbooks. They also, and we know this from polling, Doge itself among Republicans polls well. Elon Musk himself and his unchecked authority does not. And so we heard a lot of the voicing from Republican constituents last night saying this is not the person I necessarily elected and what they're doing right now.
Jake Traylor, Steph Kite, thanks so much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
The war between Israel and Hamas is fueling a rise in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States. A look at a new report on that phenomenon here on America Decides. That's coming up next. Welcome back to America Decides. The Anti-Defamation League is reporting that the number of anti-Semitic incidents in the United States reached a record high in 2024. The group tracked a total of 9,354 anti-Semitic incidents. That's a 5% increase from 2023. And get ready for this, 893% increase over the past decade. Yes, 893% increase. Jonathan Greenblatt joins me now. He is the CEO and National Director of the Anti-Defamation League. Jonathan, it's always good to have you. Walk us through the report and what you find most important for this audience to know about its findings.
Thanks for having me on, Major. I think the latest audit that the ADL published just this morning, and again, we've been doing this now for almost 50 years, the numbers are staggering. Like you said, almost 9,400 acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence last year directed against Jewish people and Jewish institutions. That's, again, nearly 900% more than what we saw a decade ago. And unfortunately, in 5 of the last 6 years, we have shattered the ceiling, if you will, and broken a new record. Now, one of the interesting things that I think we all need to point out is that anti-Semitism is a crisis. And when you are willing to trample the civil rights of a group of people just because of how they pray or where they're from, that risks the civil rights of everyone, and we find that very problematic.
There's something I want to read to you and share with my audience from the report. For the first time in the history of this audit, which you said now spans 5 decades, a majority, 58% of the incidents contained elements related to Israel or Zionism. Tell my audience why that matters and what is different now than before.
Well, look, there's nothing wrong with protesting policies of the state of Israel. Like there's nothing wrong with protesting the policies of any government. But when you, for example, vandalize a synagogue by spray painting, free Gaza on it, that's anti-Semitic. Or, for example, when you harass, college students walking into a Hillel by screaming at them from the river to the sea, that's anti-Semitic. Holding Jewish people responsible for what you don't like that's happening on the other side of the planet, that is wrong. Period. End of story. And what major has happened is this kind of behavior has been normalized in recent years. It did not used to be like this, but now it seems to be open season on Jews, where they shop, where they pray, where they live, and that's very, very frightening.
I want to get to the specifics because terminology matters in discussions of this kind, Jonathan. From the report, quote, incidents of vandalism and assault increased significantly in 2024. Assaults increased by 21% to 196 incidents, impacting 250 victims, and vandalism increased by 20% to 2,666 incidents, if I have it down correctly. Yeah. Define how you define assaults and vandalism.
I mean, a bias incident is an assault, or let's call it an act of hate that's motivated by an inalienable attribute, something that can't change about a person, like their religion or their national origin or their level of ability or their gender, sexual orientation. And in this case, acts of violence are things like assault, where people are physically attacked. Vandalism is, if you will, defacing personal property or a common good, like, say, a synagogue or a school with a swastika. And we also track harassment at ADL. So this could be something like a person being discriminated at work, or a child being bullied at school. And what's notable here is that if someone tells us, we don't just write it down, Major. Every single incident that we report, we've established it's credible. So a staff person from ADL checks it out, interviews the so-called victim, assesses the credibility of the claim. So far more incidents were reported to us than we actually could determine credible. But that's what we do at ADL. We investigate, we analyze, and we report.
Jonathan Greenblatt, I appreciate it very much. Thank you, sir.
Always good to see you.
Healthcare and religious freedom on the docket at the Supreme Court. Today, the justices heard a clash over LGBTQ storybooks and parental demands for an opt-out. This closely watched First Amendment case was brought by a group of parents from several religious backgrounds. They argue they should be allowed to exempt their children from lessons that include gender or sexuality stories that they consider counter to their faith. Obamacare, also known as the Affordable Care Act, also returned to the High Court. Justices heard arguments Monday over the mandate that insurance companies provide free preventative care for things like depression screenings and HIV prevention drugs. At issue is the constitutionality of the task force that currently decides which services insurers must cover without cost to patients. Uncertainty about U.S. policymaking has seen the U.S. dollar on a bit of a decline. What that may mean for the economy and what may be done to reverse this easing and fall. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back. Investors may be losing confidence in the United States, may be losing confidence. The dollar, as an example, has been dropping compared to several other currencies since mid-January, declining to the lowest level in 3 years. Chief U.S. economist for Mizuho Securities, Stephen Rasciuto, joins me now. Stephen, it's good to have you with us. Looking at my notes, the value of the dollar has declined 9% since mid-January. 2/5 of that decline has occurred since April 1st. Why should the average American be concerned about that?
Well, the declining dollar in the environment we're dealing with, it's just one where there's an inflation fear that has crept into financial markets, is really reflecting the relative inflation differentials between the U.S. and everybody else. The rest of the world is going to be experiencing increased disinflationary pressures, and the risk is that tariffs increase domestic inflationary pressures, and that's what's driving down the dollar. A weaker dollar could add to those inflationary pressures.
And when there is a declining dollar and rising yields, I've read that that's a warning sign. Why is that a warning sign?
Well, it's a warning sign that basically inflation expectations are increasing. And if inflation expectations are increasing, it suggests that the Federal Reserve is supposed to be putting on the monetary brakes. This Federal Reserve is clearly far from doing that, but it then opens up the potential for inflation to be higher than is currently priced in to the long end of rates, which would then wind up pushing long-term rates higher, and with it mortgage rates, and potentially putting additional downward pressure on equity valuations.
And for the U.S. government, this matters a great deal because we have to find mechanisms by which to finance our $37 trillion debt, do we not?
Well, we do. I think people are overplaying the deficit story in this environment. And principally, I think they're overplaying it and the amount of financing the U.S. government has to do, because there has been a reduction in household leverage that has been significant, actually about 17 of the last 18 years. And in addition to that, we've been seeing a reduction in corporate leverage going on for about a decade. So the reality is the total non-financial debt of the U.S. relative to GDP is down from where it was during COVID, from 250% down to about 225%. Now, it doesn't argue that rates should go lower, but it certainly doesn't say we're at a precipice where rates have to move appreciably higher. China is running at about 325% non-financial debt to GDP, and Japan is at 425%. So clearly there's room to go before we run into any kind of issues.
Stephen, as I read articles about the declining dollar and fears in the bond market, I keep reading this phrase, risk premium, as it regards investing in these devices. What is that risk premium? What does that mean?
Well, the risk premium really you have to look at is two things. One is the risk of capital loss. And when you're buying certain investments, the risk of capital loss is very significant, and you have to be careful of it. There's also an inflation risk premium. And what we've been talking about here so far is the inflation risk premium. I think if people are concerned about the other kind of risk premium, the capital loss risk premium from some kind of systemic credit event, I think that's well overplayed. There is no systemic risk in this U.S. economy. We don't have an asset price bubble. We do not have an asset liability mismatch. Those are two important preconditions to assume the systemic risk. There is inflation risk, and therefore you do have a higher risk premium because inflation risk premium is part of the overall risk premium.
And Stephen, evaluate how people are trying to gauge what the future of this tariff policy under the Trump administration is actually going to be. If it is for revenue generation, as several administration officials have suggested, that means they are near permanent. If it is for negotiating leverage, that means they can be turned on or off rather rapidly. That's a difficult thing to try to assess, is it not?
Well, I think they've been pretty clear about one thing. The reciprocal tariffs are for negotiation. The baseline tariff is less of a negotiation, probably something that is more permanent, with all the carve-outs that they've already created, in particular the carve-out for auto parts, the carve-out for the U.S.-Mexican trade accord, the carve-out for some of the technology-related products. So they've already carved out some of the 10% anyway. So I think the reality is you probably assume the 10%. If you manage to negotiate with everyone all the reciprocal tariffs away, you're probably starting with 10% as the maximum, and then you're probably carving out to reduce from there.
And very quickly, Stephen, even that 10% is much higher than we have been for a long, long time.
Without a doubt, and there will be a bit of paying the piper to pay for it. The question is who pays for it at the end. The administration is convinced the suppliers will pay for it. Market participants seem to be more convinced that the consumer will pay for it. And I will tell you, when you look at the long end of the Treasury curve right now, which is moving nowhere, it's telling you the financial markets are kind of betwixt and between. They don't know which one is going to be right. They could see it playing out on either side, and the net result is they've gone nowhere in yields.
Stephen Rasciuto, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Pleasure.
That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report is coming up next right here on CBS News 24/7.